One of the most common requests I get is, I hear this at least once a quarter, is, Saneel, we'd like you to help us create a new product or service. We'd like it to be about $1 billion in revenue in the first 18 months to 24 months. And it's like, amazing. That's probably not going to happen. And I was like, you called me because you've seen these case studies that are wildly commercially successful, and that doesn't happen.
Today's guest also happens to be a lifelong friend, Saneel Radia. Saneel's the CEO and CIO of Proto, an innovation and design company that partners with meaningful organizations that create new products, services, business models, and brands. His team's work in marketing and innovation has won every major marketing award from Cannes Lion to D&AD Pencils, and is regarded as some of the most commercially successful corporate innovation work of the past decade for clients including Walmart, PepsiCo, Shopify, and Visa. In this sweeping conversation, we dive into what distinguishes true innovation from the many who claim to sell it, how AQ and EQ within his organization's culture have outsized benefits to their work product, why reinvention is paramount to remaining competitive, and what role big data and AI have in the future of consumer experiences. I'm excited to share this wide-ranging, fast-paced conversation with one of the industry's most revered visionaries. Let's start the show. Well, first of all, thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me.
I've been excited to have you. There's a lot of things I want to unpack, especially the fact that you and I have a relationship for 30 years now. And despite all the conversations we have, which I think we have pretty substantive conversations, there's a lot about you that I sort of want to understand. I think I get sort of underneath it. But the first thing I want to ask about is homeless hotspots. I remember witnessing it myself. And I know you've acknowledged it in hindsight, because I think that was maybe from the outside looking in, it seemed like it was a very meaningful experience for you to have. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if you might just be able to explain, for those who don't know what it was, and sort of, the aftermath.
Yeah, sure. So homeless hotspots, which is a horrible name, one of many lessons out of homeless hotspots was an effort at South by Southwest. At this point, it's got to be 12 years ago, something like that, attempted to reinvent what a street newspaper was. A street newspaper is generally something that a homeless population produces and then buys for $0.25 and sells for $1. And at the time of like all media going digital, this was an artifact that was clearly dying. I mean, you were anecdotally living in New York, you can watch it dying, so to speak. And so this was basically an attempt to say, what would a new version of that look like? And so the idea was, the thing that was absolutely at a premium in Austin during South by is any form of high internet connectivity. That is easy to take for granted today because of just the advancement of cell networks, but actually the networks would be so clogged you couldn't even get like text messages out during South by most of the time back then. And it was always striking to me, as someone who's had attended for so many years, that because all of this is happening at that Austin Convention Center, one of the largest homeless shelters in Texas is down there. And so there are large populations of people that are out trying to communicate with basically what come across as like rich tech people, and those people just treated them like they were invisible, understandably. And so it was like, well, what is the thing that would get them to actually stop and acknowledge a human being that is attempting to get their attention? And we thought, why don't we supply them with like these 5G routers, like a portable kind of networking device, and then the only way to get the password is to actually speak to the person. So it was 13 people that they rent the device, so to speak. It's the same kind of model. No one's making money on this. It's like, but just so there's like some type of investment. It's an entrepreneurial type program, and then it's pay whatever you want for the Wi-Fi after you talk to the person. The only way to get the password for that Wi-Fi network that you can see, and you're probably watching other people do, is to go and talk to that person. And then when you log in, you see the name, their name, their story. Hopefully you've gotten that in person from talking to them. And then you pay what you want. And it was incredible because at the end of the day, people were quite generous with what they would pay for the Wi-Fi. So that was the program in a nutshell. The aftermath, which you asked about, is a whole other story. The aftermath actually started with an article, some defunct tech rag that was kind of gossipy, wrote an article that basically said something along the equivalent of the dystopian future is here and people have been converted into wireless antenna. And what ended up happening was then that article went viral, and then a bunch of other news outlets. I mean, when I say a bunch, I mean everybody covered it. It was national news. Jon Stewart's making jokes. I remember my first encounter with realizing what had happened was I woke up in a hotel room in Austin and heard my own name on CNN, which I had on in the background while I was brushing my teeth, and I came back out like a what just happened. So it led to just hugely like a firestorm of negative media. I haven't checked my voicemail since then. That's not a joke. Literally have not. My voicemail box has been full for 12 years. And it was a shitstorm, for lack of a better word for it. Had to go and do a bunch of press interviews, clarifying things, etc. The part that never changed was the people most supportive of it were the executive director of that homeless shelter, all of the people that participate in the program who, years later when they would see me would still give me a hug and talk about like their lives changing, because the way the program work is, obviously to basically to be able to have any form of residence at that shelter, you have to have like a savings account there, for lack of a better word, but like an account where half the money is being saved for you so that you can be permanently housed or more stably housed. And so that money ended up turning into, you know, safety deposits on apartments and those types of things. And then, the vast majority of that group at the time, these numbers do change, but it was something like 11 out of 12 or 12 out of 13, all but one ended up in at least some form of stable housing coming directly off the back of that program.
So this what's so fascinating about this is that, especially in hindsight, it's very clear the positive impact it had. But at the time, struggle. I mean, that was a challenging time. I remember having to contact your wife, Whitney, to try and get a hold of you, make sure you were still okay.
Yeah.
I remember when I finally connected with you, you said your phone did not stop vibrating.
Yeah. I just
from phone calls and texts.
Yeah.
And I remember, I think you were on an interview with Guy Risdall.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And I remember feeling you were definitely calculated. I thought you handled yourself really well. I don't remember what you said, but I do feel that it was a little bit of a slanted line of questioning. But I'm biased, so I'll grant that. What do you think you take away from that? I mean, that sort of shows. I think that really articulates in the entrepreneurial spirit in its most fundamental way, where you are pursuing something that's pure for its own sake, something that is really innovative, has a lot of positive ripple effects from that. But, what is cast in the media, whether it's a Jon Stewart snippet or, what formerly was Twitter, 160 characters, people have lives, people have, they got to drop their kids off at school. They don't have the time to go into the deep dive. And so they read that sort of snippet. And it's really unfair, right? Because I don't think it presents, you might have an objection to what you did, but to base it on that information that's being provided, I think is short-sighted, it's misinformed. What takeaway do you have from that? I mean, how did that help to shape your perspective in what you eventually built? This new entity that you have, Proto, I have to think has some DNA rooted in that experience.
I mean, for sure. It's funny. I don't think of people being time strapped as unfair. I think that, and some of that is just the way I'm wired, which is I think that I know that before I formulate an opinion on anything, I don't get into a cocktail conversation about something I only read the headline about ever. Like I'm not going to just read a headline that at this point is probably AI generated anyway, and then say I know exactly what happened here. Like I just don't ever do that. When I speak about something, I feel informed about it, and to be clear, that doesn't mean I can't become more informed about it. But I leave with a personal responsibility with that. But one of my takeaways was very much around not to take for granted the depth of education about a particular subject. So for anyone listening to this that isn't familiar with homeless hotspots, which probably puts them at a certain age or younger, because it was a story that year. What was important for me was everyone who had any level, who'd ever spent. I mean, I could draw this as a chart, and the correlation is almost 1-to-1. The more time you've ever spent with anyone who's unhoused, underhoused, or homeless, the more supportive you were of the program. And yet the people with the strongest opinions almost always were looking at something because they have an idealistic view of a thing they don't understand, but they feel invested in. They feel like they're invested, even if they are not quite literally invested. They're emotionally invested, but maybe not mentally or physically, like spending time doing a thing. I, on the other hand, was coming off the back of doing a lot of work supporting underhoused populations at the time. My company was doing that stuff, which is how we ended up thinking that, hey, street newspapers are pretty important. And when we dove into it, what we learned was actually the financial outcome of the street newspaper is not its main value, which is surprising to most people. Actually, the primary value is as a social artifact, which is the ability, when you are in that type of situation, to not feel invisible, to provide social contact. It becomes your tether to society, which is a critical step in becoming housed, fully housed, stably housed again. And without that tether, because everyone treats you like you're invisible, your chances of becoming stably housed just absolutely go, off a cliff. And so for us, the social artifact was the important part. It's why it was pay whatever you want. You had to talk to that representative to know the Wi-Fi password. And so, without that level of just kind of understanding, it's easy to go, oh, people, some brand, by the way, there's no brand involved, but some brand is having homeless people sell Wi-Fi, to save on labor costs or whatever, different stories had different theories about it. It's like, well, we just didn't state it's educated. We didn't state the education and thought that went into that, which included a number of experts, including the very homeless shelter we partnered with, co-designing the program with us. And that's the part that it's like, I knew this was credible, but I took for granted the ability to educate before diving into doing it. And so, that's a learning. Again, name's horrible. A lot of learnings in that kind of sense of just like the role of grounding in advance of hearing something that is wildly innovative, which is, because you asked about Proto, but that's a personal lesson for me. But because we do innovation work at Proto, it's like, hey, the one step I never take for granted is regrounding what it is that we're doing, why we're doing it, what insights we're building off, what we know and what we hypothesize, and then talk about the new thing that sounds pretty radical to you. And then the second big takeaway, which I'll keep quick, is like, man, there's no doubt in my mind I can do hard things. And there's a growing population. That number gets bigger every year, but a growing number of people who at some point in their life have been canceled. It's like, hey, I got to experience that firsthand, and it's a rare feat. And even if like it kind of rebounded fairly quickly by most standards, mostly because so many advocates for homeless people came out in support of this program. I got a positive letter from the White House. The mayor of Chicago asked for our help immediately on the back of it to potentially help modernize street newspapers in Chicago, which is one of the largest, if not the largest at the time, street newspaper in the country. So it's like, we've had a number of people who knew what they were talking about go, hey, there's something smart here. But you see, it was the level of education and familiarity with the context of it to go, that's a great idea, versus someone walking by and saying, I don't know anything, and the stigma around homelessness or even underhousing is insane. It is like someone made a bad decision in their life, and it turns out actually those dominoes are almost never the case, right? Clearly, mental illness is always an issue, but actually almost always it is a lack of social network. If you don't have a family network and a social network, it turns out that when you have bad luck without a network, you can immediately fall without a safety net, and that can just has a domino effect. And the ability to recover is a lot harder. It's like the hill feels very steep to climb because you don't have a network in place. And most people have some type of network in place that helps them when they're in times of extreme need. But when you're a person who doesn't have that network in place and in extreme need, it can very quickly lead to non-housing.
That's not surprising. I mean, there's hordes of studies that support the inverse of that, being the greater the social network, the more connected you are, the greater chance you are being happy, right? Yeah. I mean, so there's one thing I sort of want to pick on a little bit more, and then we can sort of transition off. But as a San Antonio Spurs fan, you and I both, pounding the rock is an idea, right? A concept that really sort of sticks out to me. And I think, anybody in an entrepreneurial position where, you do put yourself on the line, you had to take a lot of those arrows, right? From a number of different people. How do you effectively parse the process from the outcome? Because from the outside, it's very easy, I think, to say, well, that was an unsuccessful endeavor because of all the negative press you received and the hordes of public opinions that were against you. But that really is, again, a really misinformed approach to what took place there. And so maybe it's even a little bit different too. It's not just the outcome, maybe the public outcome, the public perception of the outcome. How do you view that? How do you incorporate that into your strategies in doing hard things?
Just to clean up your reference on pounding the rock, that's the Jacob Riis stonecutter story of you can hit the stone repeatedly without any change, knowing that when it does eventually crack, it was not the last blow that did it, but all the ones up into it. In this case, maybe a different way to think about it is I am, and I'm sure this had something formative to do with it, right? And I'm lucky in that, like I work in an industry or a space where people are quick to praise. Yes, they're quick to criticize, but they are quick to praise. And so, I think I get a lot of credit for that I don't deserve as it relates to, like, successful things I've participated in or played a role in. But I will say, like, I kind of treat the compliments the same way as the insults. Like, I just don't, I'm not wired that way at all. And when you do what I do for a living, some of that is just that. Like, don't get me wrong, it's nice if someone appreciates it, but I will tell you, and we talk about this at work all the time, which is, I'll give you an example. Last week we had a meeting. I won't name any clients or whatever, but I did not like and it was a work in progress, but I did not like the work in progress I was looking at. And it was had a bit of a debate with the team, but I just felt like the strategic craft was not where I wanted it to be. And we had the meeting, and it went really well. The client was effusive in their praise, et cetera. And then afterwards, one of the junior strategists on my team, this is like a day later, came in my office and was like, well, like, at least that all turned out okay, right? Like, I think a little bit relieved as someone watching some of the tension about it. And I was like, I would not say that. I think you had a good client meeting. That does not make your strategic craft any better, because then the person evaluating it doesn't know better. And that's the difference. And so I'm not going to go and undermine it by explaining to them it isn't as good as they think it is, because that would be unfair to the team. And what do I know? I might be an expert, but it doesn't mean I have the right answer. But I just kind of I don't get any of my feedback loop on this. Your opinion of it is not it. I care about its outcome. That's what I mean. So when you differentiated the perceived outcome or the public outcome versus the outcome, I'm outcome measured. The perceived outcome, I've just found, like, there's little connection between whether or not something along the way, after the fact, before the fact, someone's opinion of it and its outcome feel completely unrelated to me. And some of that's coming up in marketing. So, I guess I get to see it at its most extreme end, but when you watch it that often, you just start to divorce the two. I don't, you can tell me it was the greatest meeting in the world, but I don't care, because the person evaluating it is trusting us to know what great is. And I know what great is. And in that one example, I thought we could do better.
So on to transition off of homeless hotspots, at that point, where were you in your journey? So, and I think it's going to be helpful for, as you describe this, including myself, for those that are watching or listening, to better understand really what is entailed in innovation. But at what point did from you being a teenager, I remember you being fascinated with advertising.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like you come from the innovation approach through that advertising lens. You've acquired a multidisciplinary line of education that, no question, sort of influences that. But I'm wondering if you could sort of place that within your chronology and help us to understand that transition from advertising into innovation.
Yeah, sure. So I studied advertising at the University of Texas, and I went there to go do creative work, and then was approached by a professor who said she thinks that I would be really good in on the media side of the business. Like, she thought she wanted me to give it a shot. It was an emerging program. I really respected her. I'm still in touch with her. She was actually the one who asked me to come back and be one of the commencement speakers at the school, in that division of the school later. And she said, why don't you try media? And I did media, and I liked it. It was very analytical, but it was still like, you really have to understand human beings to do it right. If you just, like, how much can you infer about a human by the context? And this is at a time where media is changing dramatically, right? Like my career is kind of formed very specifically during, like, 10 years of media being turned upside down in the early aughts, late 90s, early aughts, because the web started going mainstream. So Web 1.0 and 2.0 were things I that kind of drove that. And so after working in media, I came to realize, like, actually, because it was still the digital media in particular was the wild, wild west. Like, there's like no set KPIs. There weren't even standard like advertising units or like what are you allowed to ask for. The editorial rules were still vague. And so actually I came to realize, like, hey, a lot of that stuff that I enjoyed was a lot of the pioneering stuff of like, how do we codify some of this and how do we like make it a system, and how do we measure what success really is, because the ways that there just weren't metrics for success for advertising. I mean, you basically go, people like that ad, or it was popular, or it became part of culture. Those are all great, but there's a lot of steps in a process in some way. And because of the realizing I liked like emerging media, I ended up then working on video games. I jumped to social media when that became a thing. I just was always kind of doing this. And over time I got to scratch that creative itch. I suddenly was doing a lot more creative work. I got hired as a creative director. Hey, lead like what is the ad campaign here? And just kind of piece by piece moving upstream. Then eventually I got brought in to say, hey, because the world's kind of always changing, we need someone to help kind of guide that. And that was the first time I'd ever kind of been given an innovation title. That was actually the ad agency I was at when Hotspots happened. So this is maybe 2012-ish, somewhere in there. And then as I was doing more and more innovation work, I'm like, oh, what I actually like is like creating the new offering, not just talking about that new offering or informing that new offering. And that's just a few steps from what real innovation looks like, which, and by the way, still brand is a big part of that. I think a lot about like, what is the purpose of this thing? Like, what is the higher purpose? What I mean by that, not just it's kind of like implementation. And as I got more and more into innovation, I realized it was just a really, it's kind of a outdated industry. I grew up like really respecting a very, probably the most famous innovation company of all time called IDEO. But at the time, as I got deeper into it, I was like, most innovation is being driven by digital things. And, this is a company that really had cut its teeth and made its success in industrial design versus like and understanding like native digital environments, what native digital behaviors are. That was actually quite insightful. And like, hey, by the way, an infinite number of new business models just got unlocked. So having to bring all of that, you just realize like there's no codified playbook for this stuff. And thus I kind of formally transitioned into doing just a lot of transformation and innovation work. Innovation, just to answer your original question, is introducing something relevant and new. So whatever type of organization you are, nonprofit, for-profit, small, big, legacy, disrupt, whatever you may be, size, scale, kind, it's like, how do you find something relevant and new to do? And it's generally held back by the fact that doing something new is hard. Every human being knows that, but it's especially hard when you're a collection of human beings. Now imagine, you're a company with a market cap of $200 billion. It sounds like it would be easy to do new things, but it actually gets harder the bigger you get because of something called innovator's dilemma. Exactly, when you're a $200 billion company, exactly what you get for a dollar doing what you do today. You have no idea what you get for a dollar doing something new. And so how do you take that risk? How do you look around and say, I will be the one responsible to put a dollar, not in the thing that we know has a set return, and instead put a dollar into a new thing that sounds like it's very high risk? And so our work is mostly helping organizations de-risk that, understand what's relevant to them. That's a step that gets skipped super often in innovation, which is like, what are you most qualified to do that is still new? What are your strengths? Don't just start with your weaknesses. I think most innovation fails because companies start with their weaknesses of like, what are we bad at? That's the innovation. It's like, that's actually the hardest thing to do. Let's find some easier habits to build before we get to the harder habits to build. You don't run a marathon if you haven't run before. It's like, let's first just learn to stretch. Then let's figure out like what jogging looks like, and like we'll get to a marathon, but let's kind of go through it that way. It's human nature. It just at incredible scale when you're with organizations instead.
So, the innovator's dilemma, I want to pick on that a little bit more. Because I think part of that is not just coming up with a strategy, right? But there's some educational component there, right? Where you're probably seeing the company through a lens that they may not be able to see themselves. And to some degree, you're expected, I would imagine, to bring in some of that perception.
100%. Yeah. You don't go and get outside help unless you believe that your inside perspective is skewed in a way that keeps you from doing it.
Right. So, where would you say education plays in, not in, fundamental education, but
I understand.
educating a client on sort of, here are some more data points that you may not be privy to, or that you're witnessing and not drawing robust assumptions from. What can you give some examples on how do you approach that when you're pitching an idea?
I'll try to keep this answer short because education is a core element of what it is that we're doing. And when you're saying education, what you really mean is expertise and innovation, right? And so that isn't necessarily, of course, there's craft expertise, but there's perspective expertise, which is the ability, the skill set to be able to take a differentiated perspective. That, in the same way that you know what that feels like as a human. Now imagine your organization and you feel like you're only one part of that organization. Are you really allowed to go and have a different perspective than what is the shared, what would be generally regarded as consensus or at minimum legacy of what's been happening before? And so some of that is just the ability to go, I'm here to generally companies do like 99.9% of, and not just companies, again, nonprofits include any size of organization at all, but 99.9% of organizations, when they innovate, do it rarely. It is like, at best every few years and often out of necessity. There's, of course, obvious exceptions to that rule. We get a lot of credit to the tech company. Amazon, arguably one of the most innovative companies of all time, kind of regularly are innovating, sure. But for every Amazon, there are, tens of thousands of other organizations that just can't do that, don't have the luxury of just that much free cash flow. And so what that means is the first step in that quote education you're talking about is to be able to acknowledge, like, look, you do this, you've probably never done this before, or if you've done it, you've done it once before. That's a moment in time. It's why you don't build an expertise inside of an organization for something you do once every few years. I, on the other hand, have had so many at bats, and so it's not that I'm, that expertise is just, I've just had more at bats at doing this than the average person, because I talk to organizations consistently while they're at that one moment in time. And you do that a lot. And it's like actually a lot of things become obvious. Like it's not rocket science in some cases, but they become obvious because you just see the same patterns. And, companies say the same things. They are self-conscious about the same things. It's like what I stated is the most common example. Let's start with our weakness, because I see something's on fire and I now want to, our house is on fire. I want to build a new house. Let's start architecting it today. And the one thing I've learned about any organization when your house is on fire is very difficult to get the entire organization to go and not focus on the fire and try to go and architect a new house. So it's like, that sounds obvious, but it's amazing how that's human nature when you're in that place when you've never done it before. And so it's like a little bit of just helping them go like, this is okay. This is normal. Let me share a similar situation. It's a different industry, but it's a similar culture, or it's a different moment in time, but it's a parallel in some way. Like just try to help clients see where this has maybe happened before, even if their situation is unique, and what could we learn from it. So that's kind of the first step of it. And then the second step of that education looks a lot like helping every organization understand that it is, yes, of course, it's a high IQ job, but actually the greatest success comes from high EQ. The companies that can do it best are purpose-led companies. Like just you can almost know in the first 6 weeks if something's going to go well or not, because you understand what type of culture they have. And some cultures are just really built for it, even if they didn't know it yet. And other companies are just, other cultures are just not built for it because they don't listen to each other, or their incentives are built the wrong way, or their organization is not willing to, risk is distributed in a way where no one, it's a hot potato instead of like a collection of people going on a journey together. And so much of that is EQ of how do we align people who are incentivized to do different things. And it's funny because like the general story around innovation is this idea of like David and Goliath. And it's like, well, David always has the advantage in innovation. It's like, actually, the whole reason that's a parable is because Goliath should have won and did not. And it's because Goliath did not play to his strengths, right? And David did. That's the takeaway. And so if you go, hey, as a big organization, we actually are operationally excellent. That's why we're matrix. That's why we separate all these. It's why different people have KPIs. That's what got us here. And when you go, oh, actually, that's the bit that's going to be a challenge for getting somewhere new, being able to go, it is a mistake we got this way. It was actually probably what got us this way, but we are going to have to do some things differently in terms of that matrix, in terms of that the silos, just acknowledging that we aren't changing everything, but we have to agree that some things have to change to do something new. Because if you measure a new thing with an old measuring stick, it will always score worse than the old thing on the old measuring stick. And so it's like, let's just, first conversation is, what would be the right measuring stick for this? Like, what are we all invested in? Let's just hear it all out and then see if we can distill that down to something simple enough that we go, okay, we've all agreed this is a metric for success. Now let's figure out what ideas look like.
Does that first step start as a brainstorming session?
Never.
Effectively?
No.
So how
Never.
do you
That is actually
parse
like,
that
again,
out?
there's too much in it, but I will say like that is if you start with the brainstorm, it never helps you. First, because we haven't agreed what we're can I have some good ideas, please? Cool. What makes a good idea? Well, we'll get to that. You hear what I'm saying? Like without a measuring stick, we don't even know what a good idea is. Second, and this is the important part, is a brainstorm has to have, you have to, I talked about like playing to your strengths. So when I defined innovation, which by the way is a definition a lot of people in the industry use now, this idea of introducing something relevant and new. Relevant is the hard part. New is the easy part. Any brainstorm, you get a million new ideas. Relevant is, okay, but what's relevant for us? Like why was my company the one that could do this and could disproportionately win, get our unfair share of this, because what are we qualified to do? And so the one of the first steps after understanding what success looks like, let's agree on that measuring stick, is what are we great at? Like everyone has their list of what they're awful at. Big companies in particular, they all have their complaints. They're queued up. But it's like, what are we great at? And so and we talk about that as, what are your assets you're starting with? And when you use a financial minded firm, like a fully financial minded firm, we're highly commercially minded, but we're much more human minded, which is to say, when they say assets, they mean like assets, on a P&L, like assets versus not liabilities, so to speak, right? It's not on your balance sheet. What I'm actually talking about is like your asset could be brand trust. It could be, we actually have a culture that is ready to embrace some experimentation, or you know what, we have like a network of partners we can call to help us with this. It's like, I'm counting those things as assets, soft assets, so to speak. Those things, when you assemble them, you start to go, hey, there might be, now I see a little bit of an outline of the space. I don't have an idea yet, but they have an outline of the space. And then in my experience, most people think then we go in a room and we come back with some genius idea, and it turns into, bubbly, in that, as PepsiCo or all the Walmart grocery stuff, or, all the stuff that people, kind of talk about from our case studies. But the reality is, actually, most of the time, that organization already had that idea or an idea and had no way to evaluate, because they didn't know what was relevant, and they didn't have it. They didn't understand that it was less risky than another alternative, because they hadn't viewed their assets yet. And if you start with those two things, it's amazing. Most companies, and I will tell you, this is the greatest fiction in innovation. You can tell the difference between people who've done it for a living and the people who are just saying they do it now, through the simple fact of, no company says, please, I will pay you and give me ideas, because every company is full of ideas. They just are. My job is to help figure out what the good ones are and the bad ones are, and then refine them based on what customers actually want. And it's just that simple. It's like, I'm actually going to go and talk to customers, some that are already here, some we wish we had. And these ideas are starting to bubble up, because I know what success looks like. I know what we're good at, and I understand the problem today, but I'm really focused on the opportunity, and customers will almost always tell me that.
So how do you determine the measuring stick quickly? I mean, I know that's a much longer answer, but it seems like you have to collaborate with the client, but you also need to take a deep dive into a culture, which could be 200, 500 people deep, right?
Oh, more
How
than
do
that.
you
Yeah.
approach that?
Most of our
Yeah,
clients have, we work with a lot of Fortune 500.
thousands of
Yeah.
people. So yeah, so what how do you assess that?
Um, Everyone will have their view of the problem, everyone. And almost always you can draw a line through that, like connect, even if the dots feel
Right.
disparate, and you go, okay, so ultimately the problem is, and I really pride myself on just saying something in plain English. So it's like, the problem is that people buy things in our stores, but they don't buy anything online. Like, it's just like, is it that? Is it that, hey, people are really happy once they use our medical services, but no one's willing to start there? Or everyone shows up for their first service experience with our organization, and then they never come back. Like, let me just hear it in a nutshell. And sometimes it's like, hey, we're just probably you can end up wanting to optimize your way through it. We're just going to fix all these little things, but by the time they've called an outside org, at this level, I think they've normally tried hundreds of things to optimize, and it's not working. So we just go, okay, you already know you have a foundational problem. I'm not here to convince you to do innovation work. You call me when you already know you need to do that, or some type of transformation. Now I'm going to state your problem super simply. And so if we can solve that problem, then that would be success. Yes, great. So is it getting more people to buy stuff online? By what percentage? What would be a reasonable number here? Let's just talk about that. And then, having done it enough, you go, that's too big an ask. This is not a joke. One of the most common requests I get is, I hear this at least once a quarter, is, Saneel, we'd like you to help us create a new product or service. We'd like it to be about $1 billion in revenue in the first 18 months to 24 months. And it's like, amazing. That's probably not going to happen. And I was like, you called me because you've seen these case studies that are wildly commercially successful, and that doesn't happen. And these things that you look at today that are huge Goliaths, or wildly successful, or added hundreds of billions of dollars in market cap to these organizations, that your speed and your request are spoken from a point of, I have a house on fire and I would like you to design a new house that is better than this one, instead of, I understand that I have to sort out the priorities to go and address the fire.
Can you give a sort of, to the layman out there that's conceptually understanding this innovation, can you give an example of maybe a successful campaign that you put together, that your team has put out there, that demonstrates, what innovation is as compared to what, sort of normal advertising might be?
Yeah, I mean,
They're distinct, right?
yeah,
They're massively distinct.
totally. And
I
to
think,
be clear, none of this is, I didn't, there's no advertising involved in most of the things we're
exactly.
talking about. And this has really been a career change. But so probably the case study I get asked about most is Walmart, which is something I did at my last organization, which, I was one of a team, but I was the strategic lead on our side of Walmart trying to sort out how to get omni-channel customers. It looked like Amazon was going to put them out of business back then. This is in 2016. And it was like, holy shit, the world has moved on to e-commerce. And even though we've been investing in e-commerce, it's not working. It's just like that. It's like, it isn't working. And it's not like Walmart was like, what's e-commerce? They're actually, you could argue they were a little too early and they separated it because they know themselves well enough to go, let's make Walmart.com its own thing. And guess what? Over time, that gap grew, and you go, oh, there's kind of a gap between Walmart.com and Walmart, and not enough people, at least proportionately for the size of Walmart. You could almost argue no one was signing up for Walmart.com. So why aren't people willing to go through the online experience for this? And that matters a ton because you start losing your brick and mortar customers. And so in that case, just to tie it right back to the strategy is, what are your strengths? And your strengths are, you have almost 5,000 stores in the US, right? That's a strength. Yet all this, and they've been working on this problem for years. When I look through all of the, traditional management consultants that help them, they all basically said, you need to be more like Amazon. Hey, Walmart, you need to be more like Amazon. Close some stores, all this stuff. And it's like, how could any strategy that didn't consider having that big of a footprint? 80% of Americans live under 10 minutes driving from a Walmart. That is a strength by every definition. You know how many companies would immediately swap places with them in that? How could that be a weakness? So no matter what we did, whatever the idea is, it better make sure that having almost 5,000 stores is a strength. So when you start going, oh, we're going to be a cloud down company like Amazon, it's like, you can't. You're 20 years behind them as it relates to being a cloud down company. You're almost 100 years ahead of them in terms of being a store up company. So what does store up look like? And that leads to things like online grocery pickup. By the way, a pilot they'd already done before they met us, but a program that wasn't being invested in, but once you go, hey, here's a metric. What if you could actually get a lot of people to register online because they were actually coming to a store to pick up their groceries? And that's rooted in a real human behavior. The people who think of Walmart as their grocery store would go there so many times a year that actually you could really build a loyal base and grow from there. So that's just a good example of like what that looks like. And then if you look through what Walmart did after that, it's all kind of rooted in the same thought. Like, how are these stores an advantage? How are the integral role we play in people's lives around those Walmarts an advantage? If you look at everything Walmart's done in that digital transformation, they crushed it. they absolutely crushed it.
That's super fascinating to think about. Well, let me transition for a second here, because I do want to address your move from becoming sort of an industry leader in this capacity, and then making the decision during a pretty unprecedented time, being the pandemic, to then launch and go out on your own. I wonder, maybe if you could just talk us through sort of what that transition was like, what you were thinking during that time frame, and maybe what you would tell yourself, knowing what you know now.
Yeah, so the transition was, I was chief innovation officer at a company called RGA, and I was overseeing what was considered the business transformation team there. So a lot of the that Walmart client is an RGA client. That happened to be one of my first things I led there, and so you already have a sense of the type of work. RGA is a really special company that I have a ton of respect for, and it's what made it special is it did so many things. It by design. Bob Greenberg is the founder and a guy I really look up to. Had an idea of reinventing the company every 9 years. Just every 9 years, we have to reinvent this company because that's the pace at which technology moves. Now that number's come down, by the way, but even just have the foresight to found a company, 40 some years ago and just guide it through all of that. was pretty incredible. And so, so it was for me an honor to be the, innovation, the most senior innovation person there, because that's a company that really is lived and breathed its own innovation, right? Like that's how much. But how do we help other organizations do it? And this company, is wildly innovative, helped Nike with things like the fuel ban and Nike Plus, and just an incredible company that's always just been ahead of its time, consistently ahead, certainly industry leading. Yet the work that we were kind of doing was very successful within the context of another thing. But RGA was also an ad agency. It was also, had a venture unit. It also had a whole design and build type business of like, designing and building out apps and, websites, things like that. And, I think as we got more excited about what we were doing and RGA, some of the other businesses, like all things, like you have cycles, and so you have to start to kind of shed some skins, which was always in Bob's DNA. But we were just at a moment of a little bit of succession planning with Bob, who was then stepping out of the CEO role, became the chairman, and then Bob being in his 70s by then, it was just kind of clear that this the company was going to start moving on from Bob. And as we kind of looked at that and said, without the specificity of us, that singular leader going, this is the future of this thing and let's do it, it led to a little bit of like difference of opinion on what the future was. It was kind of a little bit of everything, so to speak. And so we said, look, if we're serious about this, we should go do it as a pure play, where all we do is, and by the way, when I say all we do innovation and brand work and experience design. So it's like still a lot of things, but somehow that sounds focused compared to, something at the scale of RGA, obviously much smaller. And so a group of us left together and founded Proto.
It seems like your team would have to be comprised of a variety of different disciplines. I mean, if you're talking about, there's somewhat real estate related play and logistics play in the Walmart discussion that you had. I know that there are companies that are heavily financially played. And so how do you acquire that talent? What are you looking for when you build that team?
Yeah, I appreciate you calling out the multidisciplinary thing. So most consulting businesses of any kind suffer from Kaplan's law of the instrument, which is, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so no matter what that meeting is about, they're going to find a way to sell you the one, it's like, hey, if, I don't even want to pick on these consultancies. The only consultancy I'll ever openly pick on is McKinsey, mostly because that is the definition of not being a purpose-driven org, right? Like they're in the business of money, not in the business of, like we're a very purpose-driven org. But that isn't even a criticism, but it's very difficult when you're an organization and go, I don't know which way is up right now. Like I'm looking for someone to come in and just guide us towards, can you just find us a North Star? And the idea that like, well, depending on where that North Star is in the horizon, I get paid very differently is just, you hear it. It's an industry ripe for disruption. You need CRM software. Okay, cool. I don't know how that solves my immediate problem, but you're telling me that is essential to my success and I will sign up for your thing. Is like, you hear the problem. And so being multidisciplinary was kind of, from the jump critical to us. So we have, we're a 7 co-founder company, which is insane, I know, but true. People, we all have different degrees and come from different backgrounds, So you're right that I had an advertising background, but I came from a corporate incubator for hire before I went to RGA. And so, and then you have, someone, one of the most famous brand designers in the world is our chief design officer. A person who comes from a marketing and product strategy background is our chief strategy officer. It's like a kind of assembling that was really the feature. And that's, at least in our opinion, what leads to the most successful types of innovation, because instead of you just talking theoretically, someone at that table is going to be responsible for a part of this, and so they can say that doesn't work for me. And so so to answer your original question of like, well, how do you recruit all those people? It's like, well, in this case, RGA was a place that was so multidisciplinary that everyone's kind of network. You come from your own circles. Hey, you used to work at an ad agency, you used to work at a innovation design firm, you used to work at a management consultant. And that was a real lesson I learned there of like, that's actually how you recruit, is you have a leader who comes from that, who knows what they're talking about. So Proto was founded exactly that way of just, all of us come from different, we're all, the people who are well known at my company, which I have multiple, kind of very industry famous founders, all come from different industries. So they know different people and they recruit different people. And, no one ever gets asked to be on the same podcast or speak at the same festivals. And that's great because all the people they're going and talk to they just live in a different circle.
You mentioned something earlier about culture, and I just want to tie it into Proto. How do you build a successful culture? Like, for example, give us a little bit insight into your purpose, and then do you think culture? How did culture struggle in the pandemic out of the office? Do you mean how does that play a role?
Yeah, great question. So our purpose is to advance people via the scale of meaningful organizations. And I say via the scale because remember, we're a professional services company. So my clients are organizations. We try to filter for meaningful ones. And that doesn't mean that, they're scaled. They're just like, hey, that's a meaningful company, even if they're tiny, or that's a meaningful company because they're really big and impact millions of people or tens of millions of people a day. And so how do we try to advance people through the lens of these organizations? We can solve their problems, and because we're very customer and human centric, we could probably advance people while we do it. So we turn down a lot of work where like we could probably solve that as a problem, but it's maybe the organization is not going to be that interested in advancing people. So that's a real filter we use that lets us establish kind of what business we take and what we don't. And then as relates to kind of our culture, I made it myself and said chief design officer Ren Rigby. They and I codified all of our here are the principles. Like here are the things, and it was interesting because we'd worked together for years before. And obviously there's a lot of people participating in this, but like the two of us really felt the need to co-author it as like kind of the, I was the strategic lead and they were the creative lead, just saying like let's try to write down some of these things that we really believe or we've learned, and we even say some of them out loud, but we've never really codified it. So it was really important to us because we wanted everyone who even interviewed here, and when we first launched we had hundreds of people apply even though we had so few jobs, and it was like what a great way to just kind of show people this is what we stand for, and they can self-select. Like if you don't, one of our sayings is like one of those, we have 14 of these and they evolve and different employees can edit them and write them, but but it's kind of a living document. But one of the founding ones is feedback is a gift. If you you're not good at taking feedback, you're going to hate it here. You get feedback. Not only do you get feedback from people who do what you do for a living, you're going to hear feedback from people who don't do anything like what you do for a living. So that person who put together the financial forecast for the new product is like, hey, I don't know if I like that brand name. And you have to be okay with that because that's a human being who you don't just design for designers. You don't just financially forecast for commercial strategists. You don't. So it's like that's how humans work. And so we just have codified things like that. We talk a lot about our values around EQ and AQ, not just IQ. AQ being adversity quotient, because it's tough doing this for a living. So it's like just codifying those, so you just get a sense of like this is going to be what I'm stepping into was pretty important. I think the last part of your question was around just like the impact of COVID or starting as a remote company. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll answer that very quickly. It was hard. It was amazing. I went a very long time without meeting some people in person after we started. I will say I think it's especially hard as a leader, and whoever wants to cry for a single leader, but when you have to do everything over Zoom and you're the one speaking, you are often presenting into the abyss, right? And the one thing I learned, and this like was a real, and I actually, by the way, what you just asked is I put together a presentation of things I learned about having an all remote company because we were founded during COVID, and I presented it to everyone. I was like, and the thing I've learned is like, it does not matter what is happening in a Zoom box. Everyone's emotional and personal connection or reaction to it is the thing that I will always at some point get to hear about later, but not necessarily in that moment. And it's difficult. And we really talk a lot about, like we have something called a README just to help people understand each other. So everyone in their profile, like on Slack, has their Myers-Briggs, their actual Myers-Briggs profile linked to it. And then it's a README file, which is just think of it as like a README software. It's like what you should know before you work with me. And it's not like a list of demands. It's just like, hey, I'm someone who I need to process before I come back on something, or someone who's like, I'm going to talk without necessarily thinking about it. Just, it's so helpful to just go like, okay, that's who that person is. And we agree that the diversity of our backgrounds and mental models is a feature, not a bug. So let's just embrace it because it is messy sometimes.
That's great. That's great feedback. I want to transition a little bit here because you talked about scale. You picked on Amazon earlier. Not picked on it. You highlighted them, and I sort of want to bring up your white paper that you put a white paper out in April. The Innovator's Dilemma: Market Leaders are the secret winner to AI disruption. We're recording this in August. Now, I just want to read this part, which I think encapsulates it, and I'm quoting you. AI could be the first technology revolution that better serves the large incumbents and established players than it does the startups looking to disrupt them. And I want you to sort of talk a little bit about this because I got a few questions, but first of all, anything you see different now 4 months from when you wrote it?
No, I would say that is now look.
Reinforced.
Yeah, I would say it's reinforced, and you know, parts of it are reinforced. Let me be clear. Like, again, it's always whenever you summarize something, the short version is AI is a set of as it's currently built. Now, right now, AI is primarily LLM based. Okay, now LLMs are starting to plateau in terms of performance. So who knows if the next wave of AI looks like very different.
Clarify what LLM is
Large
for
language
listeners.
models. So basically, like the way Gemini talks to you when you do your Google searches is it's really just doing like, I'm going to so oversimplify this and get 100 emails about it, but just for the sake of, general podcast audience, it's a little bit of math about what the next word should be, like, hey, in the context of this person asking in this environment with at this time of day, et cetera, these tend to be the collection of words in this order that would we considered a good response based on other people's feedback. Okay. So
Yeah.
just large language. So the more language that's in there, the more likely it is to give you what you consider to be an acceptable answer, which is why you hear about training your AI. Really, what they mean is just ingesting shitloads of words. Okay, like all of Wikipedia, all of Reddit, whatever. And so as it relates to LLMs today, that has definitely been reinforced. But ultimately, what the premise of that article is, generally disruptive technologies. You always, and it's when I say disruptor to you, you probably picture a small company, and that small company is going to go and take over the world because industries get disrupted, not a company. When a company is losing, it's not competing well. An industry changes is what is the definition of disruption. In fact, if you use Clayton Christensen's definition, which I always use because he coined the term and a person that I consider to be my primary educator on innovation, it is actually a company at the bottom of a market working its way up by reforming the value proposition of the industry as a whole. So if you're a tiny company and you're rethinking what value looks like and you move your way up, that's what disruption looks like. That is great with a lot of web-based technologies, and so we got to watch it over and over again. That's why it feels like the pace of change is so fast. Web 1, Web 2, Web 3, and it's like, oh, everything's decentralized and whatnot. LLMs are really about the sheer amount of data you have and then the sheer amount of cycles you have to get feedback on that. And so that means if you have a boatload of data and you have a boatload of customers, and by the way, you have pricing power, which is generally what a market leader does, and you can do dynamic pricing as a result of those two things, irrespective of LLMs, by the way. If you put those things together, actually big companies get bigger because the main fuel on the AI fire is data. And data is really hard to just go and get. If you have 20 years of customer data like Google, that's probably going to be an advantage and is what I will say versus if you're, new and trying to do it today. So that's really the premise of that as an article. And so it's a very interesting to watch the technology du jour actually make the big get bigger.
This is, and where I'm going with this, I'm just curious sort of what feedback from your purview, having worked with the larger institutions and also sort of, being a self-educator and somebody I think who values the democratization of information. But you mentioned, and I'm paraphrasing here, former startups like Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google benefited from disruption, but data and cash-rich companies like Microsoft, Nvidia, Alphabet, Amazon are those that are benefiting. The vast data, particularly proprietary data, results in better analysis, more robust insights, and a better personalization in the consumer acquisition process. So I bring this up because how do we fend ourselves against that as a consumer? I mean, to some degree, it's almost like are we being outsmarted? And in some ways, it seems like we might be, right? But what advice do you give to sort of just general consumers who might be less informed about what sorts of data is out there about us and how it's being used to monetize our preferences?
You're asking exactly the wrong person, Marcus. I am absolutely in the camp of take my data to make my life easier. I will sign up for that. And I think when you feel like you are protective of your data, I know from knowing you for 30 some years, you're private about your data. My argument to you would be it's just no organization, or in your case, not no, but very few organizations have earned the right to your data because the benefit you get from giving them your data is not high enough. And I actually think AI will be one of the things that probably makes you, if it's done right, and that's a huge asterisk, but if it's done right, the ability to have something so personalized and high value to you, and in your case, it'll start with your phone, because your phone's ability to know everything in your life at any given moment, and then companies like Apple and Google working their way into showing you value in exchange for that data will be how you start to think about it. So there's no, if I had a secret to how to keep your data from organizations, I would be the only person on earth who could do that, because if there's one thing we've learned, it is like, it's a can of worms, and it's like an oil spill. Once you spill it, you could try to get some of it back in, but at the end of the day, that oil's out of the can. And so I think, though, what I'm more optimistic about is, I think the bar for what you get back, like that value exchange that you feel like you're shorted on regularly, which I believe to be true. Just, I'm not disagreeing with you. I just have a lower bar. I think you're going to watch a higher return on your data in terms of like how convenient your life gets, the personalization of things that happen for you. And that's, by the way, been proven with advertising. It's funny. And no one's a fan of advertising, myself included. Again, have a degree in it, made a career in it. I'm in the Advertising Hall of Achievement. No one loves advertising, let's be clear. And yet, the more data that you have, the more it changes your downstream shopping experience. Everyone loves like big brand advertising, but I mean like that ability to go, you are going to like exactly this product at this moment in time, and it's filling this need you have because we know what you search for or what you're interested in or what size you are. That is stuff where people generally, when given the choice, actually go, yeah, take my data for that. I don't want to go through all the steps I don't want to shop. Just tell me what I should buy. And so you watch it at downstream levels, and I'm hoping it starts to, move farther and farther upstream. And honestly, your phone is going to be the best frontier to watch out for that. It's happening already.
Just for the record, I actually think your buying experiences can be improved on. I've seen my life get improved because of this data.
Sure.
But how does and we'll wrap this up. But I'm curious how that applies to disruptors. I mean, I sort of think Amazon sold books online and effectively all but destroyed brick and mortar bookshops.
Yep.
As some of these companies continue to get larger and larger, how does that affect innovation for the small guy? Does that completely displace some of the startup opportunity?
It's a great question. I see them as different questions. Okay. So one is about not enough players in a space. Okay. Not, and big tech is just a perfect example of this. Is like, we had that, oh my God, I'm suddenly losing the cybersecurity company's name that had the outage where everything went down. I think that was earlier this month. Maybe it was end of July, beginning of August. But basically, you remember, like all the flights were canceled, healthcare appointments disappeared.
Yep.
It was kind of
Yep.
it was kind of Y2K, but it was from a
Yeah.
service update. Basically, if you were running Windows in an enterprise way, something went down for you. That's kind of bananas. It just shows you that the industry does not have enough players in it. You see what I mean? Like a healthy industry, and there's a few of those, right? Financial industries, cybersecurity industries, a lot of this like tech. And I totally agree with you. It's like, man, commerce is a worrying one. We're watching it, but there are, to be clear, that doesn't mean that therefore no innovation happens. What starts to happen is companies like Shopify emerge from in Amazon's wake, which is like, hey, you don't have to be the competitor to Amazon, but all the things that make it very difficult, that moat of like, well, you don't even know how to sell something online. You're a hardware store in the, in a local community, is like, why don't we make that as a service for you? So where innovation will thrive irrespective is going to be as a service for people attempting to compete. But that is why you've watched more and more, and every VC does this, is like, because they all apply the like, when everyone's doing the gold rush, we sell shovels, right? Like that's always everyone's strategy. So the things that are always funded are these like, it's startups for startups. Like that is like the most overfunded industry in the world. And it's kind of that as a thought. But, you do end up with the Shopifys of the world as a result of the very thing you just said, but it's a cycle. And you just have to go through that cycle of like something gets so big and dominant that then it starts using its pricing power, or it just says, fuck convenience for you because you have nowhere else to shop, or whatever that may be, whatever your dominance led to. And then you start to pay the toll for it. In fact, I know we're out of time, but a perfect example of Innovator's Dilemma that ties all of the things you just talked about is Google and Gemini. Google's stuck between they kind of felt like they fell behind in AI after basically inventing it, right? Inventing it is an overstatement. I'm sure I'll get some emails about that, but I mean, like, there's no arguing that the center of the AI universe was Google for a long time. And then one day you wake up and you go, wait, what? How is Google not kind of right at the top of this list? It looked like all these other organizations had overtaken them. Gemini is a huge investment. But here's the thing, it sits right on top of the thing that makes them all their money, arguably the greatest business in all of history, which is search. And so it's like, that's tough because they're looking at it and going, doesn't that cannibalize our first business? But we really see this as the future. And so how do you set the dial where you don't feel like you turned it up too slow or too fast? And you're watching them just go back and forth on that right now as we speak. It is just watch that if you want to see Innovator's Dilemma, to your point of like, that's a company that has all the data to win. But because they're a leader, part of winning means burning something that they currently have. And by the way, the lesson is always the same. Turn the dial all the way up because that thing's going to get burned anyway. It's so easy to say as an outsider. It is so hard to do when you're in it because it truly feels like you're starting the fire in your own house. So culturally, they'll debate about it, but I'm optimistic they'll realize it. But that is just in a nutshell. Watch that happen for you and from the sidelines, because you will experience it and you will watch a company have to sort it out. Exactly the thing you're asking about.
As always, I get so much value from what you have to share. So thank you for being on. I guess one last question, which is, throughout thinking about your past and looking back, what I don't think you answered it before. What advice, what would you give yourself, a younger self, somebody who's fighting, who's doing hard things in the face of pressure and backlash? What strength do you think is best focused on?
That's a great question. I would say, and this is actually summarized in a book, not even in a book, in a book title. What got you here won't get you there. And I do that for a living. Think about it. If anyone should know that, it should be me, because generally the company that got here is now asking me to help them get there. And it applies on a very human level, which is to say the very things that made me just such an successful early leader or a successful manager of people or a person who's great with certain types of clients, whatever those, managing a business, all of those things, like whatever those skills are that were great. It isn't that. I think I always pictured as I got older, my biggest fear was my skills atrophying, right? Like I'm a huge believer in like, I roll up my sleeves and I'm in the work because I don't ever want to be so far removed from the work. I'm just overhead, right? And the irony is, while I was so focused on like my skills atrophying or like just not knowing exactly what's happening and being dialed in, actually it turns out that the context of the entire world can change in a way where that thing was at one point a gift. As context change, as generations change, as you change, that thing goes from being a strength to being a weakness. And it's the exact same thing. I didn't change. The world about me has changed. And being able to look at that thing and say, that was once a strength and today it is a weakness. And I'm going to just let my ego go about that thing and understand I need to address it as a weakness, because what got me here, certainly now, it might have been a rocket ship to this place, but it is a bag of rocks as I try to get to the next place.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Saneel.
Thanks,
I appreciate you being on.
Appreciate you.
All right. We'll talk soon.
Bye.